everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Simpol Insights. In a world confronted with global warming, pandemics, increasing inequality, and political polarization, Simpol Insights aims to bring light to the darkness and chart a course towards a cooperative global society. Over the next few episodes, we're going to broaden our inquiry into civilization design, collective intelligence, and conscious evolution by speaking to a combination of people working on the front line of systems change and the giants on whose shoulders many of these practitioners stand. In the former category, and to some extent in the latter category, we're delighted today to have Michel Bauwens. Michel Bauwens is the founder of the P2P Foundation, and he works in collaboration with a global group of researchers in the exploration of peer-to-peer production, governance, and property. He writes and lectures on peer-to-peer and the commons as emergent paradigms which present an opportunity to move beyond capitalism. Welcome, Michel.
Thank you for inviting me. I've been following and I know a bit about John's work around Simpol. So really glad to talk about these commonalities of interest, global governance, global issues, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, so you've been as you say, you've been a supporter of Simpol for a while. How do you see it relating to Peer-to-Peer Foundation, and how do you see those two things connecting?
Right. So I would think that Simpol is, starts from the nation-state system and tries to go beyond it in some way. And I would think that my work is complementary because I start from civil society. And within civil society, I look at two particular things. And so those are the two key concepts for me, is peer-to-peer and the commons. So peer-to-peer refers to the fact that we now have digital technologies that allow us to scale up cooperation at the global level. So you probably heard about the Dunbar number. We can maximally connect with about 150 people. Beyond that, we need to streamline communication, and that means hierarchy and all of that. But now we have a technology that allows us to multiply small groups on a world scale. And so you would take a thing like Linux, the free operating system, that is an alternative to Microsoft and Apple, which is used by all the big companies. It's like there wouldn't be a Google today without Linux. They use it to go to the moon and everything. So Linux is a very reliable piece of infrastructure. But if you would look at the anthropology of it, like how does it work? You would see hundreds of companies, thousands of individuals not listening to the same command, infrastructure, but actually a distributed network with an average teams of 4 people. So that's remarkable. That's what peer-to-peer does. And how do you do this? And this is how we go to the second concept of the commons, is that it creates what I call holoptical systems. So to use very simple words instead, let's say open collaborative systems. So they're contributory systems where people can come in or not, they can contribute or not. And because everything is open and free in terms of knowledge, so all the knowledge is visible. That means that every individual in the system can kind of coordinate his behavior without necessary commands, right? So we call it stigmergy. Stigmergy is the language of the social insects. And so it's stigmergic collaboration because you see everything that's happening. So imagine a football match, 2 times 11 people, but at an enormous scale where you can see all the players in the game. And how do you do that? That's because the knowledge becomes a commons, and a commons is any shared resource that is maintained by either a community or a group of stakeholders, and that has its own rules and norms. So those are the 3 definitions. And so peer-to-peer enables a massive growth of commoning in our society, and that is based on enclosing the commons that existed before it became the dominant system. So if you look at every pre-capitalist system, you had a warrior class, you had the priestly class, but it had a lot of commons, for example, for farmers. So the primary ritual in the Middle Ages was called the Rogentide procession. They were called the gang days, and this was where all the people in a parish would just go around their village and say, this is from us as a collective. and this constitutes our identity. And so the enclosures meant that instead of having these common grounds, everybody had his own little land, fenced off from the others, and that would gradually concentrate and become, big land ownership. But anyway, so what the digital has done for us as humanity is to bring back this concept of the commons into kind of a normal practice. If you're a knowledge worker, you have to deal with commons. You're if you know it or not, doesn't matter. You can be a hyper libertarian, and actually, you look at blockchain and Bitcoin, essentially libertarian projects, and they entirely rely on commoning in order to function. So it's not like a partisan issue. It's an objective social institution that you have to use whatever your opinion about it. It's just like the market or the state. It's something that's there. I hope I'm not too long in my answer, but it's important because we've been trained to think between two solutions: market solutions and state solutions. And so now we're moving to an era we have three solutions. And that means that there's a lot of more social innovation in our thinking of how we should organize the world, because in each case, we can also introduce commoning in the mix.
So the idea that I feel that most people would be familiar with in terms of a commons is Wikipedia, right? This is something that most people use almost every day. And is that's to some extent an example of a commons? And is it not also to some extent an example of stigmagy, in the sense that we leave links, we shortcut links to pieces of information?
Yeah. Absolutely. So typically in Wikipedia, what would happen is if you check an article, let's say, I live in Thailand, so I'll use that Theravada Buddhism, for example, right? So you look at it and you say, oh, no, that's not true. And so in any other system, you couldn't do anything about it because, imagine having to write to the, what was it called? The old encyclopedias Britannica. That would be very convoluted and difficult process to let them know that they were wrong. But in the Wikipedia, you can just basically, you see the signal and you react to the signal. In other words, you'll offer, an addition to the article, and then you're peer reviewed by peers, and then it goes in the system or not. So that's true. So the first phase would be, knowledge commons, free software, open design. Then after 2008, we've seen an explosion of urban commoning. So after the crisis, people being obliged to think about, where do they get their energy, their food, their housing, in more difficult economic situations. So there was a tenfold increase in urban commoning that are, managed by these new forms of software. And then the third level today is what I call cosmolocal production, where we're actually starting to imagine how production of physical things could happen through this methodology. And so just to give you an example, so maybe our listeners can understand what I mean. So in Europe, we have this micro factory or multi-factory coalition. These are 120 places in Europe where artisans come together, usually in all the abandoned factories, and they work as co-ops. They work in open source ways, and they have what they call an invisible factory, which is where they share their knowledge together, right? So they're all embedded in their locality, foot in the ground, in the mud, if you like. But at the same time, they're learning from everyone in the network at the same time. So you have what I call it economies of scope, doing more with the same thing, right? And as we move from an age of abundance, material abundance, to an era of climate change, resource peaks, and scarcity, then doing more with the same becomes like, actually a priority in that we have to transform ourselves in our ability to be able to do that.
So when you were mentioning, the difficulty of trying to, update Encyclopedia Britannica as opposed to Wikipedia, I was thinking of democratic systems as well. So, a lot of our democratic systems, if you want to participate, you've got kind of one of two options, right? Either you try and become an MP yourself, you devote your life to doing it, and who knows, maybe you don't make it. Or two, you vote, and the chances of you having any impact are sort of negligible, like lower than winning the lottery. So I suppose like what we're trying to do in Simpol, and I wonder if this explanation seems right to you, or if there's anything wrong with it, is that in some senses we're trying to use the technology available to us to create a kind of global level political commons where even an individual in Thailand, for example, could have an input into global level decisions, and more to the point, would have the means to enforce those decisions, so that if their national leader doesn't enact them, they punish them by withdrawing their national vote.
Yeah, that's absolutely why I'm interested in it, because so one of the languages that I use, and I got this from a friend of mine, Robert Colin Ryan, is the idea of Magisteria of the Commons, right? So Magisteria is the language that Stephen Jay Gould used. We said there's a magisterium of religion and a magisterium of science. But you could say that our society is run by at least four magisteria: culture, economics, politics, and science. And they cannot be bound to one institution. They're networks of institutions that actually often are beyond the nation state, and that kind of decide what is legitimate in terms of speech. That's culture, right? The overton window, which determines what the two extremes are on any given topic. Science will legitimate the facts. This is scientific and legitimate, but no, that's a conspiracy theory, right? So there is a magisterium there. Politics is who gets what from tax and tax redistribution, and economics is who gets the economic surplus. But what doesn't have a magisterium nowadays are human and extra-human communities, right? So if you're a private company, your only real duty is to keep and augment financial capital. And you can, in that process, you can destroy human and environmental capital. I mean, there's some laws that limit how far you can go, but essentially it's not your concern. I've been in business for 30 years before I did this, and most established businesses, their reasoning is, if it's legal, it's ethical, right? They won't explicitly do illegal things, but they'll push the boundary of what can be done legally. They don't want to be in trouble legally with the state, but they don't want to spend anything that they shouldn't spend because they're under competitive pressure. And so I'm working a lot on this notion of a fifth magisterium for the commons. And I think what Simpol does is looking for an answer to that in a particular way. And I think there's some other ways. For example, my last report was called P2P Accounting for Planetary Survival. And I look at all the new forms of accounting that are emerging in civil society. And so that would be contributory accounting. So more and more open source communities are reinventing accounting because they want to account for all contributions, not just things that have a market value. Flow accounting, if you are a network, you have to have a vision of the flows, not just of your own entity, double entry book account, but you want to see the supply chains of the whole ecosystem. And then thermodynamic accounting or multi-capital accounting, which is the ability to manage other forms of capital than just financial capital, right? So imagine that you'd have a distributed ledger, a shared ledger, and you have like a blockchain ecosystem, because they're thinking pretty much in the same ways. And you can see contributions, you can see flow, and you can make decisions that are in harmony with planetary boundaries. Now, technically, we can do this already. So in my report, I show all the different prototypes and experiments and software systems that can do this, and I put them together. But what we don't have is a mechanism to make this coercive, right? And now coercive is a bad word, but I do think that we need maximum freedom. We don't need a top-down system that tells us everything. For example, imagine we would have scarcity in food or products. We could have rationing, right? But that's a very heavy burden on freedom. But why not imagine a system where you have a lot of freedom, but except that you know the boundaries, right? And so you're free as a human being and as a corporate entity to develop things, to innovate, to find out new technologies, but what you cannot do is destroy the conditions for life, right? And then so you look at forms of governance in which these stakeholders have a voice at every level. So they call this context-based sustainability decision making. So you have, whether you're a co-op or a bioregional administration, you have a consciousness of these flows and stocks that you need to survive. And that's your field of freedom, but our institutions that protect the common good. And that's what we're missing right now.
Mm. And that, so, I mean, Simpol uses a similar concept with the principle of subsidiarity, where we try and devolve powers to the, basically to the most local and the smallest possible scale, but no smaller. And to link back to your point earlier about companies basically overstepping their bounds and destroying the social and environmental commons, is that the problem that we've got now is that the highest level of governance is basically the nation state, and the UN is kind of toothless. And you've got international companies that are basically moving international capital around, playing countries off each other to lower their corporation tax, etc., or to lower their environmental regulations to attract big business. And so, there's nobody who can restrain companies at the global level.
Yeah, I think this is a very good approach. And so the way that we are thinking about this is that international is not enough. We need transnational, right?
Yeah.
And so, for example, one of the things that I've been playing with in another research I did on urban commoning is that you could have a league of cities, right? That says, okay, we need to mutualize energy provisioning, organic food provisioning, mobility, and different things, right? So there is this movement called factor 20 reduction. And factor 20 reduction means, can we keep complex services in the city with only 5% of the energy that we need today? And they've done some studies, for example, on transport, and which is amazing. You could have a full transport with 98% less energy expenditure if you do it based on cargo bikes and pedelecs. Using electric energy and human powered. If you're in a flat city, you can do that. You can do a lot more cargo biking. And so all these solutions are emerging in different cities, but they're not working together, right? And that's for me, it's a problem. Like I went some years ago. I went to Tuscany with the Invited by Solidarity Economy Network, and they showed me 13 different pieces of software for consumers to order organic food. And my reaction was, what a waste. If every, in one province, to have 13 different systems. So you should mutualize this, right? So this is something I call a protocol cooperative. And what is a protocol cooperative is it's an alliance of institutions. So you'd have, common good institution, which is my way to talk about the state and the cities, because they have to care for everybody. You could have a coalition of ethical and generative economic players. And you would have civil society players, which can be formal or informal. Because what I think is different now is that we're beyond the NGOs, right? We have platforms. And platforms are not organizations based on hierarchy and membership. They are ecosystems where people can join or not, right? It's a big difference. It's not the same thing as the NGO world. But so you see, you have civil society, ethical economic institutions, and the state or the cities coalescing to create a global open design depository, let's say for shared mobility, that every city in the world could use. Right? That's the combination. You do it locally, that's subsidiarity, but you learn from everyone. What's light is global and shared, what's heavy is as local as you can.
I'm immediately reminded of the work of Matthew Slater, who I believe you've met at some point. He, just for our listeners who might not know who he is, he's basically a current alternative currency designer. So he's designed all sorts of local currencies to work with people in specific instances and specific context for specific needs. But more recently, he's been working, and there's examples such as LETS systems, local exchange trading systems, like the Open Credit Network in the UK, which is kind of a peer-to-peer economic system, but without debt and interest. But more recently, he's been working on something called the Credit Commons, which is literally, as you say, it's an open source protocol where all of these different alternative monetary systems around the world can actually connect up with each other and exchange with each other, so that therefore these local solutions suddenly become scalable.
And that's wonderful. That's exactly what I mean. Yes, that's exactly, and I think that's exactly what we need, and where we don't always need the nation state to do this. And this, because what we're talking about here is a translocal or a transnational mechanism, and I'm not saying the nation state has to be abolished. I think it has a space, because I think and I think that's often where the political left, I think, is too negative about it, is the nation is still a place where people can create joint identities, right? There's a commonality of caring for a territory that is beyond fragmented interests. And then the translocal and transnational way is to take functions that go beyond the nation state, right? Because it's I think it's very difficult for a human being. Some can do it, but it's very difficult for the average human being to care for the whole world. And sometimes if you care for the whole world, often then you forget the local. It's very difficult to have a full scoping of every level for one person. It's just too much. And there's also affective issues. What is your ability to identify with people that you don't know, that you may see as rivals or competitors or even enemies? I mean, it's a very complex thing. So I think we have to really honor the two levels, which is the level of the territorial and the interterritorial, which in our world is basically interstate at this stage. But there's a whole other level, and that's a level of translocality and transnationality. And I think as human beings, we will have double orientations. Like, I live in this territory, I care about my territory, I want to protect nature in that particular context, but I'm also permaculturist, and I want to learn from all the permaculturists in the world, right? There's no contradiction, complementary. And I think if you would look at the European Middle Ages, you would see something very similar, right? So we had actually a very distributed system of competing feudal lords, but we had an institution, the church, that was like cross-European, right? And certainly in the beginning, 11th, 12th century, they were the engineers, like, the educated people were the Cistercians and stuff. And of course, we can go back to that situation because most of us are secular nowadays. But I'm a very strong believer in using maker spaces, fab labs, co-working spaces. The French have a very nice term for this. They call them open source third places, right? And at the same time, they're embedded in their locality. They train people, they give them new capacities and capabilities, but at the same time, they're drawing the knowledge from all these global streams of experts. I think that's kind of something that I want to see happening more.
And it's funny when, because I'm always trying to encourage people to sort of think more globally. And the kickback you often get is like, no, we're too global. We need to localize. We need to grow food locally. And it's like, yes, it's both. Try. I just like that idea of looking in both directions at once. It seems to be very clear.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a lot of advantages. If you look at history, the purely local is often very backward. Not learning, losing population, subsistence. And I know some people, think that's a good thing, but I don't think so. I think it's, that some of the that modernity has brought something useful in our world, that I don't see why people in some countries of the global south should be dying at 35 or 40 instead of 70 or 80. So this is so what I like is the approach of Kate Wayworth and others that basically kind of argue, and I think that's fully in my line of thinking as well, is you have a social floor and an ecological ceiling. Yeah, and that's where you want to be, in that area. You don't want to service humanity at the expense of nature and the web of life, because it will, we are interdependent, and the planet will, you know the Gaia will revolt in a way, right? It will have fires, and because the balances are out of whack. So that we have to respect, and then at the same time, we don't want to see 27,000 people in the streets like in LA. That's like, yeah, it offends everyone. It's and it doesn't create stable civilizations. It creates, social strife. So that's where we have to stay in between. Um, and I see in that context mutualization as the key way to diminish our footprint, right? So when I said factor 20 reduction, so let's take cars. Now you could say we need public transport, and that's fine, but cars bring something very important, which is point-to-point transportation. It would be very hard to lose that, like in terms of quality of life and comfort. But if we mutualize cars, so a neighborhood, right, decides to eliminate 90% of its private cars and have a pool of 10%. So we use cars 5% of the time. So if you have 10%, that's like a double buffer. And so these systems that exist already, they show that if you have 10%, you can cover any eventuality. So there's always a car for somebody who wants the car. So in that context, you have the same amount of freedom of transport with 90% less matter and energy. And it's cheaper, right? Because you don't have to buy that matter and energy. So it's also socially inclusive. And it's, if you organize it as a commons, as a co-op or an association, it's a school of democracy on top of it. And you create distributed property, which binds people, right? If you want a stable society, I mean, that was the idea of Thatcher, and I think she was wrong because she individualized it in the extreme. But the idea that when you give people a stake, they will have more responsible behavior. So that's an idea you might know this. I'm not an expert in this, but distributism. It's all the social movement from the 19th century, right? So you have state collective property, you have individual property, but in between, you can have lots of different forms of mutualized property that that work better for many things that the dichotomy we have now, which again is market versus state in a way, right?
I mean, I've come across, as well as carpooling, tool sharing. I mean, like how many times a week do you use your drill, for example? You don't need one drill.
Exactly.
You can have one drill for a street. And just to
There's
stay
a
on
study
that,
about this. 8 minutes in your lifetime is the average use of a private drill.
Oh, is it?
It's a scandal.
That's really good. So just to stay on this topic of economics for a bit, so because I've been following these sort of monetary reform systems and different ideas, and John Bunzel actually wrote a book called Monetary Reform: Making It Happen. So it's an interest of both mine and his. John Bunzel being the founder of Simpol, of course.
Yeah.
And I'm particularly interested, and I think particularly relevant to your work, are these local exchange trading systems, which are essentially open source protocols for bartering and trading, but without the pressure of debt and interest, which is, of course, one of the key driving mechanisms for ecological collapse and the sort of unsustainable growth comparative. So what role do you see these currency innovations, and in particular local exchange trading systems, playing in the transition to a peer-to-peer economic system?
Right. So I'm following a bit the kind of scheme of Bernard Lietard, who was a Belgian, like I am,
Yeah,
and
I'm
I met
familiar
him a
with
few
his work.
times, and he has a fantastic book called The Mystery of Money. So he claims, and I think he was entirely correct in this, is that before the emergence and dominance of capitalism, most countries had dual currency systems. So you had the yin and the yang money calls it, right? And so you had the money of the state, which was necessary for funding the army and the state apparatus, and then you had a lot of local monetary systems that regulated the local economy. And in his book, he mentions Bali, where you have a watershed currency, right? So that's what I see as the role of local money, is to protect the integrity of the local economy. And probably the story, I heard it before, but if you get your salary in a local way and then you go spend it in Tesco Lotus, your money leaves your region, right? Um, so that's one reasoning. It's to augment the local flow. And the second reason is to without debt, that means that you create the money to mobilize energies. That's why you need it for, right? That if somebody exerts an effort, that he can be rewarded for his effort. And that's where, of course, debt money is very problematic, because it creates a scarcity in money. And then there's a lot of people with effort, but they can't do anything because there's no reward for them, and they don't do anything. Um, the second level, I think, which is new and I think is very promising, is virtual currencies. So the difference is that instead of protecting a region, a territory, it protects a function, as it were, in a particular human community that is focused on some aspect of the common good. Because that's what open source is about, right? What are these communities doing? They take something that they think is needed in society, and then they collaborate to co-produce a solution. That's what they're doing. Of course, there's some negative anti-commons as well, but mostly, when people do this, it's for the common good. And so typically what happens today is that there will be a lot of contributions inside the community, but only some of it can be marketized. And so you immediately create an equity problem between a minority within the open source community that gets market income and a majority which is excluded for that market income. And so that's what contributor accounting is about, is you create a membrane between the outer and the inner, and you redistribute the income according to your own value judgments. So this is something I call value sovereignty. But what I'm saying is it's not just local territorial. You can have translocal currencies. For example, Fishcoin is a proposal and a prototype and an experiment to create an intelligent crypto money that reflects the social reproduction of the fish. So that every fisherman or fisher community, just knows, according to his available fish coins, how much fish he can actually fish. So that's the whole other level that didn't exist 10, 15 years ago, right? And that's what the crypto world comes in. It's the creation of intelligent money that, unlike the dumb money that we use in the nation states, which doesn't tell you, all the damage you do with money, such type of currencies actually know their externalities, right? So I think that's a very interesting approach. Um, then you have the nation state. I don't think the nation state will disappear, because I think people effectively have trouble extending their identity. There's, you know how this goes, right? It's the circle of care.
Hmm.
And first you only care about yourself as a little baby. You're hungry, and it's like that's your world. And then you learn to care about your siblings, and maybe you dream about having your own family, and then you can have family egotism, right? And then you maybe if you can care for your community. your village or your religious congregation, and then the nation is like a really big place already, right? Um, but people obviously seem to have difficulties of going beyond, right? Think about all the difficulties with the EU. The EU hasn't succeeded in creating a European identity. It hasn't. And so now we have, because the situation is negative, people are retreating to national identities, and the populist right is one of the forces that does that, right? So that's why I think, the translocal gives a way to not care about the whole world and in all its complexity, but to care about some function in the world, right? I'm not ready to care for the whole world, but I'm ready to care for, I know, hunger in the world or for renewable energy in the world, right? That's a much more easy psychological step. And so I think these types of institutions are intermediary institutions that we need to build. I think this is the era we need to do that. So it's not just about the UN. No, we need institutions that can go beyond the nation, but have a functional capacity. I don't know if that makes sense. Like,
Totally,
who's going to
totally.
care about the forest? Who's going to care about the oceans? Who's going to care about the air, right? And it shouldn't just be NGOs or international institutions. This should be multi-stakeholder, commons governance institutions.
It's interesting. I mean, obviously, I'm familiar with that. Sort of spiral dynamics, for example, this theory of the sort of values or the circle of care that we tend to align with. I don't know if the EU has been wholly unsuccessful in building a shared identity. Maybe it's not as successful as we hoped. And I also don't think that it's totally impossible to have an identity as a human being primarily. But perhaps, I understand we're not there yet. Very few people consider themselves a human being first, and a member of the human race first, and a member of their nation second. But I do think that is the direction things are going in, and that no doubt we may be suffering a step back in a certain extent to those terms. But I don't think it's out of the question.
No, I agree with you. And so one of the things that I would say about the EU is that, it hasn't given anything social to the people, right? And so, especially when you are in a degradative phase, and I think that's where we are now, right? So maybe I should say a word about that. So I see history as kind of pulsation between competitive degradative phases and regenerative reactions. So basically, nation states, empires are into the business of expanding and conquest, caring about their own expanded community, but historically overusing their regional boundaries. And so what you see is that, regularly these civilizations overshoot and collapse, and then they create a healing phase. And what happens in the healing phase is that the commons become the central institution. So just to give you an example, I think it happened twice in Japan. In the 12th century and the 16th century, you have, like total deforestation and total degradation of the soil. And then what you would have is these huge spiritual revolutionary movement that say, oh, stop with this. We need to care for divine creation. We need to love our neighbors and da 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 da. And so in Japan, particularly, the emperor took control of the land and started to manage the land as a commons. And so you go back 100 years after that, and everything is green, right? So this is a kind of dynamic over, and I call it the pulsation of the commons. And capitalism thought it was beyond it. It thought that first of all, through technology and innovation, but through frontiers, right? There's always another place we can overuse. And we just went from one place to the other, but now it's like, this is the end of the game. So I see, 2003 is the beginning of a resource scarcity crisis. You see all the commodities shooting up. That starts affecting the financial system in 2008. And they use massive, money printing, to save, the too big to fail institutions. And then we have like a really, almost invisible but austerity movement that has been nibbling on all our public infrastructures. Then 2020, COVID comes, not that bad really objectively as a virus. It's 3 times more deadly than the flu, but it's not like the plague or anything. And we so weakened our institutions in Europe that we just can't deal with it. It's like, it's we can't deal with it. And but so I hope you follow my drift. It's clearly shows we're in degradation. This is not a period of upswing where people can obtain big social reforms. And no, this is a period of we're in a downswing. It's gonna, and we have epidemics, we have enormous impoverishment, we have polarization, and then we're going to have the beginning of all these ecological storms that are coming, right? So this is a period where we have to shift, but no longer just locally, but as a global entity. We have to go into regenerative, restorative, healing modes, right? And so that's where your work comes in, where my work comes in, is that we look for how to do this, right? How to shift from a degradative to regenerative model.
I'm reminded of the work of Elizabeth Sartoris, who was a previous guest on Simpol Insights. She talks about the life cycle of ecosystems, from type 1 ecosystems, which are basically juvenile, competitive, and a sort of maturation to type 3 ecosystems, which are cooperative and collaborative. And a shift from sort of, another way of thinking about this, as Daniel Christian Weil likes to say, a shift from quantitative growth, growth for growth's sake, like a teenager eating as much as can, it's growing, to qualitative growth, where we select the kind of growth that we want. And I think humans, no doubt, we're going through a similar shift. So what I want to ask you is, I've heard you speak elsewhere about the seed patterns of a new civilization. We've discussed a few of them. Blockchain, commons, peer-to-peer, these kinds of technologies and capabilities. What do those seed patterns point to? What will the new economic system look like in your view? And just give us, flesh out that idea of seed patterns of civilization, if you can.
Right. So just maybe as a historic analogy, right? So in the 15th century, you see Europe shifting to something new. There's a crisis of feudalism, and probably the 16th century, I could say that's the beginning of the long history of capitalism. That's when it, not industrial yet, but it's already merchant and colonial, and it's definitely starting then. So if you have to know how we got there, you have to know a little bit about purgatory, because purgatory is a solution to a big problem, which is, according to the church, if you lend money, go to hell. So you can't have capitalism, or in that case, it was the Jewish people who did it, but Christians couldn't do it. So by inventing purgatory as a seed of a new logic, suddenly you can buy these indulgences from the church, and you pay for your sins in money, right? And that ushers in a way of accounting in human thinking, because people start thinking of their sins as an accounting issue.
And indeed, moral discounting.
Yeah, exactly. All these things, right? So then you have the printing press, you have double entry accounting. Those are all inventions that exist separately at first. It's just people saying, okay, feudalism doesn't work anymore, we need something new. And then they invent and plant a seed of something that in their mind is probably just a solution to their particular problem. But soon what you see is they come together. For example, the printing press, it's not just the printing press, it's also small businesses traveling around Europe, to print books, right? So it's kind of what you see is that these patterns start finding each other, and then they form subsystems. And the people who are active in these subsystems start thinking in different ways than the mainstream society. And so, in other words, if we have capitalism, it's because we had capitalists first, and these patterns, right? You could call it the commodity pattern or whatever you want. So this is what is happening now. So people are increasingly in difficulties, plus the pioneers and the prophets and the idealists, and they say, well, we can't buy homes anymore as young people. What do we do? I don't have money to buy a car. What do I do? I want organic food and I can't have organic food. What do I do? So these people are also looking for particular solutions, and because you can't solve these problems that are the result of the old system with the rules of the old system, they invite new logics. And okay, so this is the basis of the ideas, is that kind of a violent social revolution comes at the end. It's not the beginning. It's because there's been pressure for over 400 years, and that this new reality has become so strong and cannot stand the old rules anymore. That's when it explodes. And so what the new seed forms say, in my view, is first of all is that we are moving away from a contributory system, from a commodity-based system with labor as a commodity as well, to a contributory system. Contributory system take into account all contributions, positive, negative, ecological, and social, right? So we talk a lot about impact. What is impact? That is positive and negative effects. So I call them contributions as well. Facebook, relies on the contributions of 2 billion people communicating with each other in order to sell our mind or whatever they do. So we shifted to a contributory value system, and which enters in contradiction with the commodity system. So where does value come from today? I think it comes from commoning, right? Linux is valuable because so many software developers voluntarily work for Linux. And of course, there are companies involved, but typically in these systems, what you see is the companies have to adapt and follow the contributory logic. They can just say, we'll do it that way. No, they're in an ecosystem. And the ecosystem is bigger than, even if they're a very big company, the ecosystem is usually a lot bigger than the companies, than any individual company. So common-centric, that's where the value is created. And then you have to think the second step is how am I going to make a living through my contributions, right? And so this leads to the whole development of generative economies for purpose, mission-driven, social entrepreneurship, B corporations, co-ops, solidarity economies. So people are looking for forms that are at the service of something that's not entirely profit-driven. There's different hybridities. And then towards the state is the same. What kind of, how do I relate to the state? So I just published a report about public common cooperation protocols. So I've been looking at Barcelona, Ghent, Seoul. There's even a report with 1,000 examples, and half of them from the global south. So I integrated the learnings of all these research and experiments, and so I made a synthesis of how are cities adapting to this tenfold increase of urban commoning. And so you have the Bologna regulation for the care and regeneration of the urban commons, which has been copied by 250 Italian cities and has mobilized 1 million Italians in urban commoning. Right? So that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that this is already happening. It's not like this is how it should be. This is what people are doing when they're faced with the crisis of our system. And so at the same time, we have the degradation of the mainstream system, which is very painful and creates a lot of misery. But it also creates the opportunity for a lot of people to say, okay, this doesn't work, let's try something else. And it's not random. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not just random. There's a logic behind it. You have to look at it, and then you see this kind of triarchical system emerging, commons at the center, generative economic players, I call them entrepreneurial coalitions, and the commonification of public services and public commons protocols, which is how the state adapts, right? And I call this the partner state. So partner state, generative economy, and the commons as a new kind of triangle, which I think is the seed for a post-capitalist civilization.
I wonder if you're familiar with Aaron Swartz, who's sort of like an internet wonder kid. He sort of co-founded Reddit and pioneered RSS feeds, and he became a sort of martyr for the freedom of the information, so basically the sort of knowledge commons. And actually, he downloaded the entire contents of JSTOR, which is like sort of academic publications, which is privately owned by a publication, and they basically make a lot of money off the back of academics without the academics getting much in return. And so he downloaded the whole lot and was intending to publish it online as a sort of revolutionary act of the freedom of information. And he was set to be jailed for 50 years or something, and he actually committed suicide, and he's now sort of held up as like a martyr for the freedom of information and the knowledge commons. So my question is, do you think he will be considered a martyr, or do you think in some sense, are there some places where we need to keep a certain amount of private intellectual property? And so the examples I'm going to throw out is sort of pharmaceutical companies, for example. I mean, is it possible to develop, high-tech drugs for billions of pounds of budget without privately held information that isn't commonly owned?
I'm pretty much a pragmatist in that sense. So, for example, there's studies of patents that say they're really effective for 5 years. And after that 5 years, they actually, the only function they have is to stop innovation. So you look at, for example, 3D printers, and they've done it with many industries. These studies show the same pattern, is that you have a lot of innovation. Then you have the patent thing, and basically a 20-year low in innovation. And it's only when the patents die that you see renewed innovation. So I think that in this day and age where we face emergencies, ecological emergencies, it's immoral to keep 20-year patents. So we need to reduce them. But whether that would 12 years or 5 years, that's for experts to decide. But I think effectively that I mean, look at the electric car, which existed in the 1970s, and you know what they did. I was working for BP at the time, which is buying up all these renewable energy patents, and then they closed it down. They bought the companies, closed them down. So I think this is not good, when we face planetary emergencies. But in the case of pharma, I think Stiglitz has a whole book about it, where he shows that the older system, where the public sector would invest in research, was actually much more effective than the one we have now. So I don't think even for pharma this is necessary. And you have what's her name, Manzarato, I forgot her full name.
Don't know.
She has written a few books about this, showing that Google, Facebook, like 98% of their technology has been funded by the US government.
Even Apple. Something.
So what they do is they take what other people have innovated, and they kind of, they do some useful work in putting it together in a package and nice product. But whether that justifies $1 trillion markup, no, right? So we do need to reform and all these things, but in a reasonable way. I don't think zero patents. Same for copyright. I'm totally sympathetic for an author who's worked for years to do something, and he doesn't want just anybody to take it and then. So, but does he have to be 90 years? That's absurd. You know what I mean? Because actually, a copyright doesn't serve the authors. There's only 1,000 people in the whole of France that live from copyright fees. So, there's maybe 1 million or 2 million, I don't know the figures, but there are a lot more creators than that. So I don't think copyright actually works for the creators. What happens is that, you know, these copyrights get sold, and then they become, you know, monopolies. But the creators don't see that much. So again, you know, let's look at it case by case and pragmatically, and, you know, have good hybrids that satisfy the creators. But, you know, if the problem is politically, I went to some of these meetings, and, you know, at the EU level, and they would have governments and private companies talk about the creative industry. No consumers, no users, no creators. Right? That's the problem. They make all these laws that don't actually take into account the primary stakeholders in these systems.
So we're coming to the end of our time here, and I actually am going to sneakily try and package two questions into one in order to fit them in. So I know that you are aware of Inspiral, and I actually tried to join Inspiral. I'm currently trying to join Inspiral, and I wondered what other sort of peer-to-peer experiments that are you most excited about, or alternately, where do you think peer-to-peer solutions are most needed? And then finally, do you think peer-to-peer frameworks could improve Simpol in some way? Do you think there's something that we're missing, a blind spot that maybe the sort of peer-to-peer or commons lens could shine a light on? You can take those questions in either order.
Right. So yes. So on the one hand, I look at what the things you say, which is what I call them post-corporate forms. So Inspiral is one of them. In the UK, I'm looking at the Ethos Foundation. In Brazil, I was looking at Furadoeixo, which is a coalition of musicians, you know, which is like extraordinary. So I have a list of a dozen examples on one of my wiki sections. Then I'm looking at a lot of the blockchain space, and I need to explain to you why that is, in my view, important. So blockchain is one thing, but what I'm looking at is distributed ledgers, right? So the internet, the first layer of internet, is an internet of communication. And it allows us to talk to each other, self-organize in affinity groups, even do some kind of, you know, basic economic collaborations. But the blockchain really enables distributed accounting. And that means that stigmergy can move from the immaterial collaboration to the material collaboration. So I look a lot at things like Common Stack, Commons Engine, Holochain, Economic Space Agency, you know, because they're really innovative in trying to create these open collaborative systems. And I find them very interesting. You know, you know, you have the territorial layer, but I'm talking here specifically about this virtual layer, right? Because the internet is a nomadic technology. We're no longer working with thousands in the same place in a factory. We're moving from project to project. If we don't physically travel, that's not what I mean, but we work differently, and we are engaged with commons in our work. And that's a world unto itself. It's just as real as a physical world. So I don't like these dualistic understandings of the world, you know, the real and the virtual. No, you know, this is very real. You know, this is and you know, you look at politics, and this is very, very real. The GameStop affair, but even the thing on the Capitol, right? That wouldn't have taken place if half the population believed entirely different things about, you know, and that all happens in the media, in the social media. So this is very real. So I'm very much looking also into these thermodynamic things, right? It's how do we re-embed our economy in the physical world, and what kind of tools can we use to do that? So my favorite there is called r3o.org, which is reporting 3.0, and they're multi-capitalists. So the basic idea is mono-capitalism only cares about financial growth at the expense of everything else, but multi-capitalism is a requirement that economic entities have to care for human ecological and financial capital at the same time. And what are they're very advanced in thinking this through. So I'm looking a lot at public commons cooperation. How do cities reinvent themselves? Because commoners distrust the state. They don't want to be in a dependent client relationship. So it's a big challenge for cities to find ways of cooperating that are actually accepted by the people involved in these projects. I know it will sound maybe silly to you, but I also look now at rituals. I think I mentioned it in our conversation that the primary ritual in the Middle Ages was the Rogantide procession, which is parishioners beating the bounds and looking at their commons and confirming every year. That was a big part of their identity. So now there's a lot of people thinking about how can we recreate unity, in virtual work, to avoid social isolation, and there's some good stuff. So yeah, I'm sorry, I have a kind of a broad thing.
It's all good stuff.
Yeah, I think I try to think holistically. So you have, you're familiar with Ken Wilber and Spiral Dynamics. You have the
Of course, yeah.
internal, you have the external, you have the collective interior, collective exterior. So you have culture and organizations and technology and the psyche, and all these things have to be working together, right? Creating virtuous loops. And maybe I will tell you one more thing. The big issue now is that regenerative work is badly funded because we get wealth by extraction, and then we tax or we do philanthropy, and that gets the money to the people who try to repair the damage. This is an entirely wrong way to look at things today. We need to fund the people who are restoring the health of the planet. And so I'm looking at how public ledgers could be used so that people could self-register their contributions, that there will be some kind of peer review system to guarantee the authenticity of these contributions. There would be tokens, and the tokens would be funded either by taxation and or by the institutions that profit from these positive externalities. I'll give you an example to make it clear. So in France, we have a community land trust movement called Terre des Liens, and they already, they have like 100 million euro capital, so they're big. They have calculated already in 2016 that their work was saving the French state 350 million euro in depollution efforts. And they're not getting anything from that, right? So imagine we'll have a system where the depollution agencies would say, we will give 30% of what we save to a fund, and that fund allows you to buy more land, so you have more organic farmers and even less pollution, right? So that's the kind of solutions we need to think about. And that's where all the blockchain and the DAO thinking comes in, to create this kind of smoother automatic transaction systems that don't need a big bureaucracy to manage these complex systems.
Well, thank you, Michel. I think we're going to have to wrap up there, but it's been absolutely fascinating. And there's no doubt that humanity is in a very interesting moment. We're experiencing collapse and transformation at the same time, and as you say, the seeds of something new are springing up all over the place. And I think the P2P Foundation is an excellent hub and repository of a lot of these different seeds. And I encourage you all to check it out. I also just like to say it's funny that you mentioned Ken Wilber, because he's actually our next guest on Simpol Insights. And, he was exactly who I was referring to when I said he's the giant on which many of us stand. And it's no surprises to hear you reference him. So yes, but I'd just like to say thank you very much, Michel. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching, and stay tuned for the next episode where we'll interview Ken Wilber. Bye, Michel.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.